This is Glenn Loury of The Glenn Show at bloggingheads.tv, and I'm very happy to be talking with David Grusky. David, would you introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm, as you mentioned, David Grusky, and I'm a professor of sociology at Stanford University.
So, David, we're talking here about the issue of inequality prompted by a very interesting piece that you had in the Boston Review magazine, current issue, thinking deeply and creatively about how progressives who are concerned with the problem of inequality in American society, the 99% versus the 1%, might be thinking a little differently than some of us have been thinking about that problem. Your piece argued, and you should have a chance, of course, to explain it in greater detail, that a lot more can be done than has been done to reduce the amount of inequality that's produced through the market before we even get around to talking about how much taxes we're going to have on the rich or whatever. And it created some interesting discussion at the magazine. And I thought we just might spend some time talking about those ideas and, then having some back and forth around that question. Are you up for that?
Absolutely. It's a good time to take this question on.
Okay, so then why don't we just start with you giving us a little bit of a summary of what you're doing in this article in Boston Review, and what the outlines are of your ideas about how the country might deal better with the problem of inequality.
Sure. The core argument of the piece is that we've perhaps moved prematurely to the assumption that the best and only way to take on rising income inequality is via a tax-based redistributive agenda. And by that agenda, the claim is that what we should do, the main and perhaps only thing that we should do to take on rising income inequality, is to tax more aggressively at the top of the income distribution. I should say that I think, indeed, we should redouble our efforts on the tax front, and we should, indeed, engage in more redistributive taxation, just as the typical presumption has it. But my position in this piece is that we ought not stop there, and that we ought to also undertake more fundamental institutional reform. And the reason for that line of argumentation is that, firstly, it's very hard in a tax-fearing country like our own, it's very hard to sell an increase in taxation, even if that increase were focused at the very top of the income distribution. The second, and maybe more fundamental point, is that the tax-based redistributive agenda is founded on a misdiagnosis of what the source of the takeoff in income inequality is. We now have ample evidence indicating that even before we engage in any taxation, there's been a spectacular takeoff in income inequality, in pre-tax income inequality, in the size of the compensation that we bring home on the basis of the labor market involvement. And so, if we want to take on the takeoff in income inequality at its source, we would be well advised to look to those institutions that are generating these very differently sized paychecks within the labor market. And so, I further go on in this piece to suggest that line of argumentation is quite consistent with an Occupy Wall Street agenda, an agenda that often makes reference to corruption, sweetheart deals, various types of bottlenecks that are generating compensation within the labor market that's in excess of the worker's true marginal product or contribution. Or in other words, to use the term that many economists like to use, what we're seeing is an economy that's rife with rent, with compensation that's greater than one's true marginal product or contribution. And then go on to give two examples of rent. I'll just swiftly run through them so that you can get a more concrete understanding of what I mean here by rent. And the first and I think most obvious example of rent is the excessive returns to college education that are part of this takeoff in income inequality. And as we well know, that one reason, an important reason, not the only reason, but an important reason why there's been an increase in income inequality is that those folks who go to college are getting more of a payoff as compared to those who don't than was the case before. There's a rising gap between the college-educated and all others, and that in part underlies the takeoff in inequality. Now you then might ask, why is it that those folks who are going to college are getting more returns than was the case in the past relative to those who don't? And I think one important reason that hasn't been fully appreciated is that we ration higher education. It's not the case that anyone who comes up to Stanford University or Brown University or Harvard University, plunks down their $60,000 and says, I want a degree, can go ahead and get one. Rather, we ration those degrees. It's not the case that those folks who want to buy them can. And that means that folks like you and I, who have a college degree, are protected from competition. There's a shortage economy underway that ramps up our compensation because we're protected. And likewise, at the bottom of the class structure, among those who don't have college degrees, there are just too many folks. There's this reserve army. There's a surplus of folks who don't have a college education, and therefore are competing among one another and driving down their wages, raising unemployment, and creating more inequality. The second example that I give is that of CEO compensation. Here again, it's a straightforward example, just one example of how our economy is rife with rent. And the argument here is that CEOs are compensated in effect by board members who sit on the board at the behest of the CEO. And so there's all sorts of reasons why board members who are advantaged by virtue of sitting on that board would like to stay on such boards, would like to be attractive to CEOs as board members, and therefore will deliver ample compensation packages. And so there's at least the appearance of impropriety, the appearance of a sweetheart deal, and again, the suspicion at least of rent at the top of the income distribution. And so the argument here is that our job should be to look very carefully at institutions that deliver compensation and try as best we can to identify where they're generating rent and then take that rent on and try to do what we can by way of institutional reform to eliminate it.
Okay, so the baseline point is that if you want more equality, you can look to equalizing market remuneration as well as the tax system. And maybe it wouldn't be such a bad idea to look at equalizing market remuneration, since there is such an aversion to redistribution through the tax system.
That's right.
And then you offer some examples of where you think unequal market rewards are, in some sense, unjustified, are based on some kind of insiderness, some kind of corruption, or some kind of bottleneck which policy could alleviate. So there are low-hanging fruit in the inequality business here. There are opportunities to get more equality without having to raise anybody's taxes, just by fixing what's broken with some of the inequality-producing aspects of our normal economic and educational activity.
That's right. Very economically put. That's exactly right.
Now, let me ask you a question about that. Why do you think, first of all, how does the United States compare with other societies of a similar degree of development in terms of the progressivity of our income tax system? And relatedly, why do you think that the politics of taxation, I'm going to guess that Americans are less redistributive in our tax system than our Northern Europeans, but you can tell me about that. Why is the politics of income taxation and redistribution through the tax system so different, apparently, in the United States than in the UK or Germany or France or the Scandinavian countries?
Yeah, well, that's a good question, and indeed, it's important to bear in mind that we're distinctive in the United States in two ways. We're distinctive in that, at least compared to, say, the extreme example of the Scandinavian countries, we engage in far less redistributive taxation. But we're also distinctive, and this is a way that I don't think is as fully appreciated, we're also distinctive in that, at least again compared to, say, our Scandinavian, to the Scandinavian countries, we generate much more inequality within the labor market. So there's two ways in which one might want to take on inequality. There are two opportunities, as it were, two ways in which we're distinctive. One, we do less tax-based redistribution, and another, we generate more inequality in the labor market before we even get to taxation. Now, the question is which one of those pathways might be best undertaken. In a country like the U.S., where we have an aversion to taxation, one might well argue that it makes sense to do what we can to reduce the amount of inequality that's generated in the labor market. If you're in Scandinavia, you might well make more headway with the tax-based redistributive agenda. Indeed, they have. And there's much to be said for pursuing that agenda in the context of a country that doesn't regard taxes as anathema. But that's not our country.
I'm asking you why you think the U.S. Differs from, say, the Scandinavian countries with respect to how much of an anathema we apparently seem to regard taxes to be.
Well, if one looks at the actual practice of taxation, we do less of it, which would be suggestive, at least, that we are more troubled by it than is the case in, say, social democratic countries. And I think there's ample evidence, if one examines the sorts of debates that are carried out here as compared to Scandinavia, ample evidence that we're averse to taxes, more so than is the case there. We have a commitment to market-based economies here.
Okay, so there's an ideological difference. I gather then your answer to my question would be that the U.S. is distinctive with respect to the ideology that seems to govern at least many voters' assessments of these matters, and we tend to be, I'll just be saying it again in different words, more averse to raising taxes here in this country than they are elsewhere. The deeper reasons for that we may not know, but they hardly matter for the question at hand.
Exactly. We have to work within the constraints that we find ourselves, and one very important constraint is this aversion to taxes.
Well, let me tell you why I'm asking this, because, and we'll get to this, supposing that whatever remedies one might have in mind for pre-tax inequality that's produced by the market, more of which is produced here in the U.S. than in some other countries, whatever the remedies are one might have in mind for that, preventing high-end colleges from restricting their enrollments or somehow impeding the ability of companies to lavish excess compensation on their executives, those remedies might produce their own inefficiencies. And if it were possible to persuade the public on the income tax question that we'd be a better society, a healthier polity, we'd be able to solve more of our collective problems if we were prepared to tax ourselves at a higher level, or at least tax the rich people among us at a higher level. Fighting against the ideological presuppositions against taxes is another way to go. So if you're saying it's easier to fix pre-tax inequality, you need to demonstrate, don't you, that whatever instruments are available to change people's ideas about taxation aren't worth our effort. We shouldn't be going around, as President Obama is doing right now, giving speeches trying to persuade individuals that we're all in this together. And we shouldn't be engaged in public education campaigns, as I take it the network MSNBC is right now, trying to persuade people that, we should tax ourselves so we can build bridges, fix our cities, improve our schools, or whatever it might be. Rather, we should be getting rid of the market inequalities that we can get rid of. Am I understanding your argument correctly and doing it justice? And if so, there's an economic cost to whatever you might want to do, isn't there, to reduce inequality of wages? And then there's somehow a cost in terms of politics of trying to fight against this ideological aversion to taxes. I'm just wondering why that latter isn't worth the candle.
Well, I think it's important to distinguish between the many different reasons why one might engage in taxation. One reason, and the one that I've been taking on now, is engaging in redistributive tax policy, with the idea being that a more aggressive taxation at the top of the income distribution is a good weapon in reducing income inequality. There are, of course, many other reasons why one would want to tax, and they're good reasons. Often there's a collective infrastructure that needs to be maintained, and taxes are seen as the best way to preclude the free rider problem, and hence we engage in taxation so as to ensure that we have those bridges and other types of infrastructure. Of course, my argument is not in any way inconsistent with that line of reasoning, and I would of course subscribe to it. I'm rather trying to focus on the question of whether or not the only way to take on rising income inequality is via tax-based redistribution. And there, I think the important point to be made is that we can have our cake and eat it too. The advantage of undertaking reforms of the sort that I've been advocating is that they should be efficient. We're talking about sweetheart deals. We're talking about corruption. We're talking about having a disjuncture between one's compensation and one's real contribution or marginal product. We will generate a more efficient economy by correcting those problems and, to boot, as a bonus, a less unequal one as well.
Okay. So let me then ask you a little bit about that. You say that there are rents. Now, I'm an economist. You're a sociologist. We economists take our terminology seriously, and we don't necessarily think there's anything wrong with rents. I mean, you use it like it's a dirty word. If I own a tract of land that is much more fertile than the next fellow down the road, I would expect at the end of the day that I will get rewarded in the marketplace for access to my land at a higher rate than the fellow down the road. The reward that I get may be far in excess of what it would take to induce me to allow someone to use my land. And the difference between my reward and this fellow down the next step down the road would, in most economics textbooks, I think, be thought of as a rent. It's a pure reward to the qualitative difference between what it is I have to offer to the market and what this other fellow offers. And it well may be in excess of what it would take to get me, what I could do in my next best alternative employment of my resource, this qualitatively superior land. It may well be more than I need to bring it to the market, but it still wouldn't be inefficient for me to be differentially rewarded. Likewise, if one CEO is better than another CEO at the CEO game, even if he's only slightly better, but if that superior business acumen were to have a significant effect on the profit line of the corporation involved, so that it was extremely valuable to have this slightly better CEO, I might find that people were getting very substantial rewards far in excess of what it would be required in order to get them to do the job, as it were, their next best alternative. You might want to think about that as an economic rent to the executive's talent, but there wouldn't be anything inefficient about it, or for that matter, anything corrupt. You can reproduce these examples. I don't know what the neurosurgeons are getting at the Massachusetts General Hospital relative to the neurosurgeons in Kansas City. No offense meant to Kansas City. But my guess is that the very best neurosurgeons who are sought after by well-heeled patients and all the rest are doing really pretty well. Their marginal productivity is one thing, and their market remuneration is another. The two can diverge under various conditions of scarcity and, as I say, qualitative difference. But those differences wouldn't be inefficient or corrupt. So I guess that's a long-winded way of me, the economist, asking you, David Grusky, the sociologist, to explain to me what's so bad about an economic rent.
Well, I think you're right that we want to talk about, in very concrete terms, particular types of rent that are a consequence of corruption, sweetheart deals, bottlenecks that would be problematic with respect to both efficiency and would at the same time generate income inequality. So if we go to the CEO case, I'm sure you wouldn't be supportive of high CEO compensation solely because the members of the board want to ensure that other CEOs will find them as attractive members of the board because they can be counted upon to deliver a very liberal compensation package. No one would want
No, I wouldn't.
It provides that type of, that rewards that kind of impropriety, right? And so that's what I'm talking about. And that's what we should do what we can to extirpate.
Well, again, economists, and especially those who are within the vicinity of the University of Chicago, where the free market faith in the free market reigns, but even some of us out here on the East Coast are inclined to think that when there's an awful lot of money on the table, and when there are countervailing interests, corruptions of the sort that you're attributing to, people who set executive compensation can't persist for very long because there are real strong incentives for someone to do something about it. In the case of a corporation that's governed by a board of directors that may be engaged in a sweetheart, in effect, kickback arrangement with corporate management, put me on the board and I'll vote for a high compensation for you. Countervailing interests are available. Shareholders who are not on the board of directors and who do not have a direct benefit from management's self-dealing, but whose bottom line will be affected by the extent to which the company's resources are wasted. Paying an executive more than he's worth is throwing money out the window from the shareholder's point of view. They should be expected to object. I should expect there to be lawsuits brought against members of the board of directors by minority shareholders who might feel that their economic interests have been ill-served by a board that is engaged in sweetheart deals with the management. I might expect there to be takeover activity from corporate raiders who see in a poorly managed corporation that pays its management way more than it's worth an opportunity to make a profit by acquiring the company, firing the management, and replacing them with people who are paid in a manner that's more commensurate with their skills. In other words, I think there would be a kind of Moneyball effect, if you like, with the popular recent movie. If the system of compensation of athletes is corrupt, somebody ought to be able to get into the game, figure out what athletes are really worth, pay them their worth, not the corrupt price, and end up profiting in the bargain. So don't you have to tell me why that doesn't happen in your example of corporate executive compensation if it's going to serve the purpose that you wanted to with your argument?
Yeah, certainly the types of reforms that enable shareholders to better insist that compensation is totally in line with marginal product and nothing more or less, those types of reforms are very much under debate and to some extent underway, and they should be applauded. That's exactly the kind of reform that we need and that some folks are beginning to undertake. It's all to the good. And all I would say in this regard is that it's hardly at this particular point in time the case in which the will of the shareholders can always be perfectly reflected in compensation policies. There are various problems in translating that shareholder will into policy. We should do what we can to ensure that translation is as good as possible. And so I'm totally sympathetic with those types of reforms, and indeed those are the kinds of reforms that I think we need to undertake. But it would seem that there's surely the appearance of impropriety under a system in which board members sit at the behest of the CEO, and we ought to eliminate that kind of system. And if indeed then compensation remains after doing so at the very high level we now see, then we can all get behind it. We can applaud it. We can say that's more likely to be the true marginal product, and then that's a good reform because it gives legitimacy to compensation practices rather than the suspicion of impropriety.
Yeah, okay, so we agree about that. I'll just note that the reform of allowing boards, shareholders, I should say, to have their interests better represented by boards on the assumption that they're not well represented now is something very much worth doing regardless of its effect on inequality. Wouldn't you agree with that? I mean, that's in effect about property rights when we have agency or delegation. right? The people own shares in the company. They own the company, but they can't be there day to day, so they have agents, a management, and a board of directors overseeing that management, to which they delegate discretion. And in a way, their property rights are not well respected. In a way, they're being made victims of a kind of appropriation, misappropriation, or theft, to the extent that the resources which they own end up being funneled off to somebody because of some kind of backroom or double dealing or self-dealing arrangement. So that's quite apart from inequality. And in fact, I wonder empirically how big an impact it could possibly be on aggregate measures of inequality in the society if one were to change the way in which high-level executives are compensated. There are not so many of them, and there are a great many high-earning people who don't earn their incomes from boards of director influence executive compensation in the professions, in the small business sector, in the sports and entertainment, and so on, who I expect would outnumber corporate executives by some factor, and whose incomes are also sometimes quite higher, quite much higher than the typical American household. So I guess I'm asking two different kind of questions here, but the main thing is, even if we could get rid of this rent that you're talking about on the assumption that it really is illegitimate remuneration, do you think that would do very much about inequality in society in comparison to the many other sources of inequality that aren't subject to this corruption criticism?
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And I offered that example as one that is very much part of our public debates now, and hence one that's frequently discussed and well understood. And hence it's a simple example of the possibility, at least, of sweetheart deals, corruption, and rent. But I am wholeheartedly in agreement that it's but one example. And my larger argument is that we are running an economy that is, by all appearances, rife with rent of this sort, and that we should turn toward identifying all the various forms of rent that are in play. I hope that we'll talk about education and education rationing as one such form of rent. But I can mention here also the types of occupational closure that are very much on the increase and that also generate rent of various sorts. For example, it was once the case that one could work one's way up through the corporate hierarchy without an MBA. One could be a top manager without an MBA. There wasn't a credential-based allocation system. And by now insisting on a credential, we're establishing bottlenecks that allow, again, for the possibility of rent to be collected. One of the big developments of our time, I don't think it's been well appreciated, but nonetheless should be, is that just as unions have been declining and the so-called union wage has therefore not as frequently been collected, just as that's been happening, we've seen a ramping up in the number of folks who are working within protected occupations that have various types of associations guarding their boundaries and certifications and training requirements being in place. Those sorts of protections at the occupational level, which are typically at the top of the class structure, offer the opportunity of rent, but rent that now goes to the top, whereas the type of rent that's in decline, the union-based rent, is offering compensation for those who are typically lower in the income distribution. So we have this grand transfer of rent from the bottom to the top, and that's another example of an inequality generating type of rent that's in play, and that we should think carefully about. But I think,
okay, David. Sorry. Go ahead. Finish your thought.
No. Go ahead.
Well, we should get to education, and we should do it immediately, but a couple of points come to mind just on what you've been saying now. The union example is interesting because by your logic, the decline of unionization is a good thing for equality, at least equality amongst workers, in the sense that the union, non-union wage premium is a very classic example of the kind of economic rent that you're decrying. The union gets a lock on access to work, collectively bargains for a higher than competitive wage, and then is insulated from competition by the requirement that anybody who is employed by the firm be paid the union wage. So wage inequality amongst working people would be less to the extent that that premium, based on the union's ability to control who can and can't get through the workplace door, to the extent that that premium is less. So do you accept that, which is a kind of anti-progressive sentiment, it would seem, that that unions are bad for equality amongst working people? Amongst working people.
Yeah,
not between
amongst
workers and
working
capitalists, I grant you that, but yeah, amongst working people.
Amongst working people, but the overall effect on income inequality is, of course, an equalizing one. That is, unions operate to reduce inequality because they provide more wages at the lower end of the distribution. Now, of course, if you just look at the lower end, unions do introduce inequalities within that lower end, but that's an important distinction.
But hold on, wouldn't I want to distinguish just on this point, and of course this is not in any way your main point, between, let's say, craft unions? What about plumbers? What about electricians? You know what I'm saying? Who may restrict access to the trade itself. You can't be certified unless you're an apprentice and unless you go through this and that. So now plumbers are getting whatever they're getting. I call a plumber to my home. The deal is between me and the plumber. I'm paying that plumber a lot more than I might have to pay him because there's a union that restricts access to plumbing. There's some high school graduate somewhere who could learn to be a perfectly decent plumber, but he can't get in because he's not in the union and he can't get access to the work. And the result is inequality, and I'm not sure where the capitalist was in that particular example, that unless it's the homeowner who has enough money to be able to hire a plumber. But it seems to me like that's just bad for equality, that you can keep somebody out of the plumber trade or the electrician trade or the carpenter trade or the bricklayer trade, etc., based on whether or not they've been accepted into some club.
Well, I think this is a good point. I would argue to step back and try to understand that dynamic in the context of the type of education rationing that's undertaken. So here's the social compact, as I understand it, that held before this takeoff in inequality. Basically, the working class was said, you're going to be locked out of a college education. You're going to be locked out because you're going to be disproportionately found in poorer neighborhoods in which you don't have access to high-quality primary and secondary training, and you won't then be in a position to get a college degree. But, in exchange, we're going to give you the union wage, which is a type of rent. And so there's a worker disadvantaging type of rent that's in play, namely disqualification from access to higher education. That harmed workers. But in compensation, they were given another type of rent, the union wage. At least some of them were. Now, of course, some weren't, and they were doubly harmed, right? But some were. But now we have a new social compact in which we've taken away the union wage. There's been, of course, this dramatic decline in unionization. We've taken away the union wage, but we haven't at the same time opened up access to educational credentials, to college degrees, to the extent that we should. And so now the one type of rent that advantaged workers has been taken away with no compensation, and so they're in worse shape than they were before. You could fight rent with rent, which was the social compact of the past, but now those at the bottom of the income distribution have nothing. And what I'm suggesting we should do, and this is the segue into the education rationing discussion, what we should do is open up access to educational credentials, such that everyone, no matter how poor their family may be, no matter how poor their neighborhood is, everyone should have access. Everyone should have an opportunity to acquire a college degree.
Now, let me observe something before going to the college thing, which is, as an African-American economist and someone aware of economic history in the United States, I'm reminded, as you were just talking, of the fact that for many decades, unionization and equal opportunity for African-Americans were at a tension or maybe even conflict in labor markets throughout the country. And, I mean, blacks working as strike breakers, only being able to get in, unions being, racist, and the extent to which they would admit blacks and so forth and so on. So, not to put too fine a point on it, but just to say, the role of unions with respect to equality or inequality is complicated, as you suggested, and maybe even more complicated than was reflected in the remarks that you just made, at least when we take that racial thing into account.
I think that's an important point, and I of course agree wholeheartedly. Sure. Although the union wage advantaged some workers, there were very systematic ways in which other workers never were able to gain access to unions, and hence that advantage was quite unequally applied. Absolutely.
So you're a professor at Stanford. You think that the university there ought to allow anyone who can afford to pay the $60,000, or whatever it costs to go to Stanford for a year, to come there and study?
Well, you have to answer that question from the viewpoint of different actors. If I were, say, the provost or president of Stanford University, my answer to that question would be absolutely not. It's not in the interest of Stanford University to water down the value of its credential in that way and simply sell it to whomever puts down the $60K or whatever it now costs. So, from the standpoint of Stanford University, that would be a very flawed policy indeed. But from the standpoint of someone who wants to reduce inequality, I do think it's very troubling that we are rationing higher education. And what the effect of that rationing is that those lucky folks who have that degree are protected from competition and thereby have excessive returns. So you and I, Glenn, are in great shape, of course, by virtue of being protected from competition. It's not the case that all people who are born into poor neighborhoods or born into poor families have access to quality primary and secondary training and hence access to college. We're protected,
but wait a minute.
And we benefit from that protection.
Wait. We had to compete to get in the first place. The universities admitted on the basis of very strict competition. The students had grades and test scores and essays and extracurricular activities and letters of recommendation, and only the elite applicants to a place like Brown or a place like Stanford end up winning in that competition. So why isn't it placed in the university the legitimate prize for a meritocratic competition amongst applicants as to who were the most qualified students to study?
Well, I think it's a matter of when you begin looking at the process. That is, from the point of view of how Stanford or Brown or Harvard run their admission process, they're just trying, by and large, to get the best folks, granted. But that doesn't mean that the profile of applicants reflects a fair and open competition from day one, from the point of birth. Far from it, and I'm sure you agree. If you're unlucky, so unlucky as to be born into a poor family, if you're so unlucky as to be born into a poor neighborhood, you're not likely to have access to high-quality primary and secondary education. So just by virtue of the luck of birth, you're not in a position to develop the types of qualifications that would be attractive to a Brown or Stanford. And that means that those folks who are admitted to Brown and Stanford and the like are protected from competition and reap windfall profits as a result.
I'm also not sure about that last bit. I mean, let me suppose, and we can come back to it, that the fact that Brown admits 1 out of 14 applicants means that the 1 in 14 lucky few who are admitted are, quote, protected from competition. Those 13 who didn't get in didn't evaporate. They might have gone, instead of to Brown, to the University of Connecticut or the University of Massachusetts or someplace like that. It's not as if their access to higher education has been somehow eviscerated by their not being admitted to Brown or to Stanford. There are many institutions out there. Why is it that they don't get an education? And if Brown is an elite place, well, the University of Massachusetts or the University of Connecticut, they're not chopped liver. You can get an education there. Why are the graduates from Brown then insulated from competition, quote unquote, by the fact that they were only 1 out of 14 applicants to get into Brown? The other 13 went to UConn or the University of Massachusetts. They're also out there competing for jobs and for wages. So what is so special about elite higher education? That's basically my question.
Right.
I understand that it's selective, but does it really produce so much inequality? Excuse me for interrupting.
Yeah, no problem. I do think it's important to expand the argument here. It's very convenient to focus on elite institutions because it's something that you and I understand and are very familiar with, and it puts the argument in a compelling way. But the argument should be expanded, and the argument should be expanded in the following way, namely, we need more slots at the elite level. We need more slots at the level just below the elite level, say the econ level. We need more slots across the board, insofar as we're committed to an inequality reduction project. Because the effect of having more slots will be to introduce more competition at the top, and to suppress the returns to those various types of credentials at every level. And so I think an inequality reduction project that makes sense is one that increases the number of slots and that calls into question our current practice of education rationing. And I should say again that there's two advantages to this type of reform. One would be that it reduces inequality, but another, and equally important, is that it reduces inequalities of opportunity. That is, insofar as we do it right, and insofar as we call into question a system in which opportunities at the primary and secondary level are available on the basis of one's family or neighborhood, insofar as we call that into question and say that everyone, no matter their family or neighborhood, should have access to high quality primary and secondary training. Insofar as we do it right, then we'll have more equality of opportunity, something that I believe everyone can and should commit to.
Okay, well, I want to talk very much about this equal opportunity, or about the foundations of opportunity, which of course are not just the market or institutions of higher education, but which also involve the way that our communities are constituted, the social and spatial organization of our metropolitan areas, and the character of human development outside of these formal institutions, like what goes on in the home, in the family, and all of that. So that's a question of equal opportunity. I'd like to come back to it, but before doing that, I want to ask you about technology, about skill-biased technical change, about automation, and the transformation of methods of production that end up putting a higher premium upon skills. Isn't one reason, my impression from the economics literature certainly, is that the widening of the dispersion of incomes is not just happening in the aggregate, but it's also happening within industries, within occupations, holding constant educational levels. The variance of income amongst people who have college degrees has widened, even as the gap in mean income between college graduates and high school graduates has widened. And people are putting forward various theories and efforts to explain why it is that we're seeing a wider dispersion of remuneration to people across many different ways of slicing the population. And one of the answers that they're giving is that, there's computers have been introduced, the specializations of various kind in the workplace have come into existence embedded by technology, that the sort of market pressures on wages associated with the expanded integration of the global economy have had knock-on effects that exacerbate inequality. And there are many, many arguments, other arguments beside, but they all turn on this idea that the pre-tax distribution of income has become more unequal, not only or even not mainly because of increase in people's ability to protect themselves from competition, but have become more unequal primarily because the very instruments or means of production have shifted in such a way that differences amongst individuals and their talents or their abilities end up being much more important in the production process, and therefore end up being reflected more fully in the rewards that people are getting. So you see the question, it's kind of a big question here. I'm asking about how other factors that produce inequality besides the non-competitive rent-generating phenomena to which you have called attention, other factors like technical change and the global integration of national economies are being considered in your argument. It seems to me that perhaps you're not giving them as much weight as they would deserve.
Yeah. No, I think that's a very good point. And I guess I should stress from the outset that I would hardly argue the one and only source of inequality is these various forms of rent or non-competitive institutional practices. It's one source of inequality, and it's a source of inequality to which we should commit to eliminating, because it's inconsistent with everything we believe in, and it's arguably also inconsistent with our commitment to efficiency.
Okay.
So yeah, let's take on that type of inequality that's generated by rent, corruption, sweetheart deals. Let's build institutions that are as best as possible rewarding just marginal product and one's real contribution. And then we'll see how much inequality there is at the end of the day. It will be less, but it won't certainly be the case that there's none. And then we can decide as a country whether or not we want to proceed any further in reducing inequality. But it should be at that point a kind of inequality that at least many people can believe in. That's legitimate. It's simply a function of differentials in marginal contribution. And we may well decide at that point to stop. But we're so far from there that we don't, my view is that we don't need to talk about those other sources of inequality because there's so much low-hanging fruit, as it were, of illicit inequality that we should take on. So yeah, you're right. There are other sources, but those aren't the kinds that we need to address at this point in trying to reduce inequality.
Okay, I think I hear you. I hear you on that, and I think I agree. I certainly agree with the observation, the common sense observation, that if you don't like inequality, and if there are at hand some means of reducing it that are relatively low cost for you to exercise, then you should avail yourself of those means, even if the bulk of the inequality problem that you confront is not driven by the phenomenon that you're about to try to remedy. They're low-hanging fruit, pick them. So that much seems clear. Now, the extent to which some of the examples that you've given actually constitute low-hanging fruit is something that we can argue about and have been disputing a little bit here. But I certainly take the point. But let's come back to this question about equal opportunity, because a lifetime ago in the 70s when I wrote a PhD dissertation, it was on inequality. And my point was to say to the human capital theory types within economics, that's the Chicago School, Gary Becker and all the rest, who claimed that inequality was due to differences in the skills that people presented, skills which were rewarded under competitive conditions in the marketplace. And if you wanted more equality, then you should increase the human capital of the people who had less skills. The market would take care of the rest. My point to them was, the way that people come by getting skills in this society is not itself a market or a fair process. It's unequal in many different ways. There's no such thing as equal opportunity from birth in this society. There may be equal opportunity for people who present themselves with college degrees from good institutions at the age of 23, but there's not equal opportunity for newborns. Some of them are going to be born into families where the parents are, poor, poorly educated, stressed, limited time, single parent, bad neighborhood. Some of them are going to be born into much more favorable conditions in the society. Some of them are going to have the benefit of inheritance, whether it be direct financial contribution or it be in-kind contribution through getting an excellent education at home, good health care, traveling around, having experiences. Others are going to be impoverished in that dimension. And the result is going to be that when they're 23 years old, some of these people are going to have college degrees from places like the University of Connecticut or Harvard or Stanford, and others are going to be high school dropouts. And that's not just a reflection of their innate skills, that's also a reflection of the opportunities in society that they did or did not enjoy. So that if you're really concerned about equality, I said then, and I would say now, you need to focus on what are the barriers to the human development of people occurring in a more or less equal fashion. And those barriers, it turns out, are very formidable, and it turns out that the bad guys on the other side of the equality fight, when you talk about those barriers, are not Mitt Romney type rich guys. They're middle class and working class people who are fiercely protective of the quality of their neighborhoods and the quality of their schools, and who want their kids to get ahead of other people's kids, and who act in ways that promote their own private interests but may not advance efficiency and certainly are not good for equality. So having made that speech and having invoked my 35-year-old dissertation, I'm wondering, David, what you have to say about that.
Well, it's hard for me to disagree with much of what you say. I think it's completely consistent with a rent-based account. That is a very important reason why those at the top are securing excessive returns to their educational credentials, is that they're protected from competition from those people who are born into circumstances that don't allow them to acquire a quality primary and secondary education and position themselves then for a quality college degree. So I don't think we disagree much on this. What I would say is that we pay lip service to this commitment to equal opportunity. Lip service, and we have flavor-of-the-day reforms that are often marketed on the basis of improving educational quality rather than reducing inequalities of opportunity. I think our commitment, our primary commitment, our main commitment, we should fight a war against inequality of opportunity because it goes against everything we believe in. And if we were to successfully wage that war, we would have much less income inequality as a result because it would reduce the monopoly position that now accrues to those who have an educational credential. So I don't find much between what you've said and much difference between what you've said and my own position. I can only underline it. I think you're absolutely spot on, and think that that's the kind of problem to which we should commit in a wholehearted way. Not these minor reform efforts, but an entire overhaul of the education system.
Well, we're going to need a completely different politics if we're going to do that. I mean, think about one of the implications of this line of argument that we're following right now. We should have more equality of opportunity. If we want more equality in the society, less of a gap between the 1% and 99%, then we need more equality of opportunity. Well, if we want more equality of opportunity, that means that when we provide for the education of youngsters, we want that process to result at the end of the day in something that is roughly equal, whether the education is taking place in a well-off suburb with high-income families or it's taking place in a hard-pressed inner city with families that are struggling with poverty and other social ills. Well, if we're going to achieve that outcome, then the public inputs that go into creating opportunity, like how much one spends and invests in the education of the children, will have to play a compensatory role. And you'd have to spend more on the education of the kids in the inner city who don't have well-educated parents at home and who may be dealing with all kind of environmental effects that impede their acquisition of skills, more on their education than you spend on the education of kids who come from well-off communities with well-educated parents and nice, stable, middle-class homes. Well, that's exactly the opposite of what happens. And I dare say that there would be a revolution in this country if you tried to reconfigure the institutions so that the sons of doctors and lawyers and business managers and so on went to public schools that were less well-funded than this, substantially less well-funded, in an effort to achieve equal opportunity than the schools that were attended by the sons and daughters of the unemployed and those who've just been let out of prison and those who were unwed mothers at the age of 16.
Well, yeah, I think the key point here is that you're advocating a more aggressive intervention than I think you're right is politically palatable. But we should be, at bare minimum, prepared to commit to a regime in which the same amount of spending occurs on poor kids and rich or middle-class kids. The same
Absolutely.
amount. That would be an extraordinary advance relative to what prevails now, and the kind of equality to which we can and should commit. I don't think there's anything in our values that's inconsistent with that kind of commitment. Now, you're right. The next step, a compensatory regime in which you're actually spending more on children who are born into poor neighborhoods or families, would be perhaps a much more difficult political agenda to pull off. But why even worry ourselves with that when we would achieve so much by simply establishing equal conditions, regardless of the family into which you're born or the neighborhood into which you're born. So I think, yeah, you're biting off more than probably is politically palatable at this moment in time. But I think an equality commitment is something that is politically palatable and is consistent with our most fundamental values.
You know, I wonder about that, David, and I'm not now arguing with you. I'm really literally just wondering. I spent a year in New York City in the last academic year when I was on sabbatical leave. I visited Columbia University. And I heard one story after another about competing to get your kids admitted to a preschool. Okay? You wanted to get your kid into the right preschool, and it required a strategy and it required real effort. But why did you care about the right preschool? Because you wanted to get your kid into the right prep school. And why did you care about the right prep school? Because you wanted to get your kid into the right college. Now, these competitive games were being played out amongst people who almost to a man and woman were at the relative far left of the ideological spectrum. People who would never think for a moment about voting for, let's say, Mitt Romney over, let's say, Barack Obama. But such people were engaged in these fierce competitions to get an epsilon and iota of incremental advantage over their neighbor next door in order to get into the right school. So, wow, that kind of zero-sum competition strikes me as reflective of, I don't know, a deep feature of our political community here in the United States. And it leads me to what I think probably will be my final question to you in this discussion, which is, you know, if we had more social solidarity, if we really believed this idea that we're all in this thing together, if there were more of a sense of community, characteristic of the politics, especially the social policy politics of the United States, then we'd be a long way toward being able to implement policies of the sort that you advocate that would increase equality of opportunity and equality of economic status in the long run. But here in the U.S., it seems to me, and this really goes back to my question at the beginning about why it's so hard to raise taxes in this country, it seems to me that we've been for a long time about the business of, you know, becoming solidaristic, and the decline of unions perhaps is one instance of this, the fragmentation of our politics. But, you know, the idea that this kid on the other side of the tracks is, you know, there but for the grace of God go I, and we're all in this together, that's not an idea that seems to have any real traction in American social politics. So again, I wonder what you think about that.
Yeah, I think it's a good closing point, because it's again a point on which I think there's going to be considerable agreement. If there's any disagreement, it's where one might usefully intervene in this complicated dynamic. And
yeah.
if your argument is that we can effect a cultural change without changing our kind of institutional preconditions, then I might diverge with you a bit, because I think the point at which the intervention is most likely to be effective is at the institutional point. So obviously, everyone, myself included, has an obligation to do the best that they possibly can by their children and assist in that class reproduction project in the context of the institutions that are in play. I don't begrudge those folks in New York City doing everything they can by their children. We believe that the family system is something we can commit to, and parents should do what they can by their children. We think that's a strength. We should just make it difficult for parents to exploit institutions in a way that advantages their children in that way. We need to set up a level playing field so that parents, of course, commit to doing whatever they can to assist their children. But rich parents don't have as many advantages as they do now. They shouldn't be able to buy their way into better schools than is the case for less advantaged families. We should make that institutionally difficult. We should have high-quality schools available for everyone. And then all parents will work as hard as they can to assist their children, as hard as they can. But it won't be the case that rich parents have as much of an advantage as they do now. So we need to set up institutions that are consistent with families doing whatever they can for their children, but don't deliver as much of an advantage for rich parents as they do now. And I'm sure I suspect we disagree on this. Agree on this point.
We definitely agree about this. And as I think about it, so I've had some health challenges of late, not to get too personal, and I won't go into the details, but the bottom line is I talk to friends and they want to know about the quality of my doctor, you know? And, you know, some of my friends are well connected and they know the, you know, chief resident of this or that at this or that big hospital. And they say, oh, well, you ought to go see so-and-so. And, you know, I'm getting perfectly adequate medical care and I'm not, you know, concerned that I'm not being well taken care of. But this idea that I got to get the best doc, it's very hard to resist it. And yet, you know, not everybody can have, quote unquote, the best doctor. I mean, if surgeons differ with respect to their, you know, skills, and it's known by patients who the more skillful surgeons are, of course, no one is going to want to settle for the second best surgeon, and yet the best surgeon could not possibly treat everyone. So this idea that, you know, who do you know, some kind of contact, you ought to go over here and see this one, you ought to, you know, in order to make sure that I got better medical care than the next guy, because that's what I'm after. I'm after better medical care than is generally available. It's a very tempting thing. It's very hard to resist falling into that, it seems to me. And it strikes me that that's one aspect of human nature that might make it very difficult for us ultimately to, you know, to implement an egalitarian program. I don't mean to be a naysayer here, and I'm not being a naysayer. I'm just observing there's some stuff that's going on out there that I think is really very deep in terms of generating inequality.
Well, I think again, the idea is to try to set up institutions, in this case, a healthcare system.
Healthcare, indeed, right?
That doesn't allow money to speak to the extent that it does now. It doesn't give so much of an advantage to those who have the requisite contacts, who have the money to purchase more life. I don't think we want to commodify that to the extent that we have. And so again, it's a matter of setting up institutions, in this case a healthcare system, that delivers more equal opportunity to get health. And then we let the obvious self-interested processes play out, but in the context of an institution that doesn't deliver as much advantage to those who have levels of resources at their disposal. So I think it's the same sort of logic. We need to set up institutions that don't provide so much advantage to those who have lots of resources.
Yeah, and the thing is, what you just said is a kind of no-brainer in Britain or Canada or France or Italy, but it's called socialized medicine in the United States, and that's a bad word.
Yeah. I think
so. We got our work cut out for us.
Well, I think the kind of arguments that I've been pushing here are much easier to swallow. They're arguments about people being compensated in accord with their marginal product, people getting pay that's consistent with what they're delivering to their firms, what they're helping to make, and they should get no more than that. This is something that I think resonates with our deepest commitments. And so I don't think it's a hard sell. I agree with you that what we were discussing with respect to healthcare is a harder sell. And for that reason, might well be very, very difficult to push in the U.S. context. What I'm trying to push here, though, is something that does resonate with our values, that Republicans and Democrats alike should be able to get on board with. And for that reason, I think it's a kind of agenda that has legs.
That's great, David. I'm going to let you have the last word, and thank you so much for coming on and talking about your work. I hope to meet you face to face one of these days, real soon.
Likewise, it was a great discussion, and I appreciate the opportunity.
Okay, take care. Bye.